Janice Morphet is a visiting professor at the Bartlett School of Planning, and in recent years, she's been tracking the increasing number of local authorities who have been delivering their own housing. This month, she published Reviving Local Authority Housing Delivery, Challenging Austerity Through Municipal Entrepreneurialism, and she wrote that together with Ben Clifford. So, Janice, perhaps you can tell me, I mean, how many local authorities in England are now building their own housing, and what mechanisms are they using, and how many houses are they actually delivering?
Okay, well, I think the last question is the most difficult because we don't have very good methods of collecting the data. But we're just to say right from the outset that Ben and I are expecting now to do a third round of our research in the new year. So, and we can come back to that and the kind of things we'll look at. But just to say, we would like to know as well. So I think we're kind of on the case, but we'll probably have figures the middle of next year now. So when we last looked at this, which was about a year ago when we collected our data, what we found was that 78% of councils had a company of some kind. About 48% then had a housing revenue account. But I think probably since then, both of those numbers would have increased because certainly when we were looking back then, of those councils that didn't have a company, about a quarter were actively engaged in setting one up. And even in the pandemic, we know that councils like Manchester and Leeds, who had quite big housing operations but didn't really have a company, have also started to look at that. I'm not saying they're going to do it, but they're kind of looking at it. Manchester's just appointed a new director of housing. So I suspect they'll go in that direction. Leeds possibly slightly further behind. If we actually look at housing revenue accounts, I know the government expected the number of councils to go up with an HRA after they removed the debt cap. And I think initially we haven't seen that great surge. But I think slowly some councils are looking at it. And for example, in London, Bromley has been looking at this in terms of providing housing, particularly for homeless people and temporary accommodation. So maybe we'll see a more selective approach to HRAs. And I think the reason why HRAs haven't really been used as much as perhaps the government hoped or expected was that because I think, we still have right to buy, and councils have realised they can use other mechanisms. They can still provide social rent. They can still give a 5-year rolling tenure, even if it's not the same guaranteed tenure that you would have as a traditional council tenant, if you like. But nevertheless, I mean, that's probably better than you would get elsewhere. So I think what we're seeing is the sort of, I think during the pandemic, we've kind of seen a consolidation. And I think what we found in our research is councils generally start with one problem, start with one issue, maybe a site or a building, or what to do about rising homelessness costs and the kind of horrible accommodation that homeless families will have to be put in. And then gradually they kind of expand their repertoire and they try new things. As new sites or new problems or new issues come up, then they think of another way and they kind of gradually expand. So what sorts of things are going on? I've got a list here, so I'm just going to refer to it and to remind me of the things so that I make sure I include them all. So obviously you've got lots of councils directly developing, and councils in London are doing that, but councils outside of London as well. And Bristol is probably one of the better known, and Birmingham, and they both have a range of housing types. I mean, Bristol are experimenting with looking at older people's housing with younger people living with them, and all sorts of things, as well as housing for sale and social rent and so on. Obviously, many councils, about half of councils are doing JVs, and that can be quite small, from North Lancashire, just looking at a development by development, to very large, where you kind of look at Slough and Morgan Sindall. And obviously, if you look at Bournemouth, they're doing over 20 housing developments on their car parks, each of them with a different partner. So, you've got lots of different models, I would say. Some councils are purchasing stock from housing associations. So East Riding recently bought 140 dwellings to enhance their own stock. And some councils are actually setting up housing associations. So we think here of Lambeth, which is a not-for-profit, and Wokingham, which is a for-profit housing association. We've got lots of councils. Well, some councils are purchasing from developers at various stages in the development, and so we can think of Brent here, who are tending either to buy off plan or once completed but vacant. And I think we've seen a great upsurge of this kind of approach from the development industry to local authorities during the pandemic. We've got lots of councils working with other councils, because you can do a JV in all sorts of ways. So that might be, say, like Lewis and Eastbourne, who are kind of have a very long track record of doing this, but other councils like the West of England combined authority councils around Bristol, they're actually developing in each other's areas and actually taking interest in those developments in perpetuity, even though they're not in their own council area. So, and that's to meet different needs as well. So, you know, there's a lot of different approaches. Obviously, some councils are selling services such as housing management. In Hackney, obviously, they've got a joint development team of about 60 now. And Islington and Camden are now purchasing their services. And it seems to me that's quite a good area in the future, where either you can share the risk if you're building up a team, or it's kind of like a franchise model. You can help other councils get going. Some councils like Southwark are considering opening a DLO. We haven't got many of those. Nottingham's got a DLO, but not many. Obviously, lots of councils are assessing their own estate. So many of them are looking at either using their own town halls for housing, or to do developments which enable them to put housing around the town hall. So obviously we can think about the countryside scheme in Waltham Forest, which is redoing the whole campus. We can think of the scheme for Hammersmith and Fulham, which is actually going to turn the town hall round and face it towards the river and have housing alongside. These schemes, and Lambeth as well, these schemes are actually getting 50% affordable. So that's all very impressive. Spelthorne has already completed its development of parts of its council building into apartments. Councils are also building because they want to demonstrate that you can build well. And you know, whether that's design, whether that's passive house standards. Exeter's building everything passive house. Bristol has very high standards for every development it does. Some councils are acting as a bank, and Warrington is in the news today, but I mean, I was aware of it before in terms of what it's been doing to fund other councils. And then some councils are doing interesting and innovative things individually. So think about Southwark, who's been looking at the land ownership in its area and finding that other councils own land in their area, that other councils' pension funds. So they've been approaching the pension funds of other councils, in their case Glasgow, to see whether they can do joint development, which is in the pension fund's interest, but also in the council. So that's quite innovative. Obviously, they're buying land. So I hope that gives you a kind of flavour. And I think any council, if you put that on a great long menu and you started to fill in which councils are doing which, I think, you know, you'd find each one's doing a different kind of menu, a pick from those. But you can see it's flowering. It's becoming more granular in terms of finding the right approach for the right sites. I think that's really where they're going at the minute.
Yes, some are investing in other things. Energy companies, I think, is one of the areas that some councils are investing in. But we do hear concerns about investments by authorities in slightly more risky property assets, and you know, one wonders if the example of Croydon is likely to raise alarm bells in Whitehall, and whether there are limits to, might say, the entrepreneurialism that local authorities can actually deliver.
I mean, I think, well, firstly, just on the property side, councils buying property, that's generally considered, the debate is generally about commercial and retail property. And I think if you look at the advice from SIPFA, they would much rather councils didn't buy that kind of property. because it is essentially risky. You don't know if you're going to get a return, if you're going to get tenants and so on. Although it's also true to say that quite a number of councils have actually turned offices into residential. And not all office to resi has to be poor. You know, you can, and you can think about a previous wave, can't you, of BT buildings and so on turned into Premier Inns. So, you know, there is a kind of legacy of that. So it doesn't, it can work particularly, but I think the property industry's been quite thrown by councils getting more heavily engaged, and there's been quite a lot of lobbying going on for a while on that. In terms of, and I think, I mean, you know, often councils are named who've done quite a lot of this, but Spelthorne was one of the councils we had as one of our case studies last time. And I don't know about now, this was a year or so back, but they struck me as being quite cautious. You know, all their asset management plans, their investment plans are all in the public domain. There's nothing, you know, nothing hidden. You can see what they've been doing and what returns they're getting. So obviously COVID will have an effect on that, but there was nothing under, you know, there's nothing under the counter there about what they were up to and why. And I think so, you know, I mean, I suspect that a bit of that would go on. And I think if you think about Woking, I mean, Woking bought it already owned the Peacocks, which is a big development in Woking, but it also bought its other older shopping development because they didn't feel it was being managed very well, and also because it was having an effect on the value of their existing property. So, you know, there are asset management strategies for doing these things. But coming on to Croydon, which is what you've asked me about. I mean, we haven't looked in detail at the amount of money going into each company, and that is maybe something to look at in the future. But my sense is that the kind of level of funding that went into Croydon, which I think was reported as 200 million, is what I've read in the press. So I don't know if that's true, but if it's of that order, that seems of a very different order from the kind of levels of investment we've seen elsewhere. So though we haven't particularly gone out to collect that information, obviously you do hear about it in passing. And I would say most councils are investing less than 10 million, and they're investing it over a few years. And so it's more like they keep it in reserves, and it's more of a drawdown facility rather than taking 10 million and passing it to the housing company. So, I mean, I know in Swindon, I think they allocated a larger sum than that, but they kept it in drawdown. So that means in terms of risk, it only appears on the balance sheet, if you like, associated with development, once the development goes forward. And I think, so there are smaller sums, they're very, each development is capitalised as it goes. It's all, every development has to wash its face and so on. I don't think that was quite the model in Croydon. And I suspect there was more anticipation of investment, and I'm not sure if it was a drawdown. So I think that's what I would say. We're seeing a kind of cautious approach, and I haven't come across. I don't think there are other councils that like Croydon that I've come across. So I mean, there may be, but I'm not aware of them. So I think that's an issue. I think from government's point of view, I mean, I'm sure SIPFA is as concerned as government about this. And I think councils are pretty cautious, but, you know, every council makes up its own mind. It's, you know, it makes up its mind about how to do it, but yeah.
And so you've clearly been researching this subject for some time, but and when COVID came along, did you realise now that you could tailor the content really to deal with this next phase of austerity, which we're likely to be seeing over the coming years?
Well, we certainly, when we were completing the book, obviously COVID was there, although we hadn't gone out and done any specific surveys on COVID. But nevertheless, by talking to people participating in webinars and so on, as I said earlier, the kind of pressures of COVID seem to be, if you like, encouraging councils to move more in this direction. And my feeling is, although this is not a researched finding, but it's just a kind of sense that now local authorities engaging in housing delivery of one of these different methods, whether it's buying secondary properties, whether it's buying new properties from a developer, or developing yourself, or with JV, they've become kind of now part of the normal game plan of every council. That's not to say they're all doing it to the same extent. Some of them may not have started to do it, just be gearing up. But nevertheless, I think now most councils see it as part of their kind of portfolio of action. And so it's become mainstream. And in a way, given the work we've done over, well, since about 2016 on this, I think one of our objectives was to try to help councils feel more confident, to talk to each other, not to us, to each other, find out, how to do it, what the wrinkles were, what the difficulties would be, or the risks, so that if councils did want to do it, they could do it in a way that they felt secure and they felt they weren't on their own, because we could see how many councils are doing it. I think until we did our survey, really, I don't think most councils appreciated that other councils were looking at this. And I think what we've done is kind of surface what was already there, and enable it to become a bit more mainstream. And also, I think to some extent, the government's treatment of local government over COVID has seen it as a sector, it's marginalised it. But as we know, even from this week, from the new lockdown arrangements, or the tiered arrangements post-lockdown, then the intensive testing that is going to be offered in high incidence areas is going to be run through local authorities. Now, the approach in England has been very different from the approach in Scotland and Wales, where local authorities, health, have all just been doing this together from the outset. But in England, in a way, councils have really had to kind of be very patient for the government to turn to them when, the World Health Organization advice is always to work locally on these issues. And of course, when we look back to foot and mouth, when we look to the petrol tankers drivers strike, when we look at flooding, it's always been, and even think about local government itself was founded because of public health reasons back in the 1880s. So, public health is kind of the life of local government. And then to have a government that's more or less excluded it, or seen it as a bit of a nuisance. And even today, Matt Hancock was kind of trying to drive a wedge between the mayor of the Liverpool City Region, Steve Rotherham, and Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester. Well, anyway, good luck with that, trying to drive a wedge between those two. But nevertheless, that kind of I think local government is a bit shocked by this. I mean, they're dealing with it, but I think they're shocked by it's really crystallized the government's attitudes towards them in a way that they thought was there, but suddenly now it's very present. So I think there's, in a way, it will give more councils more resolve to try to, to be self-funding if they can, and housing is one mechanism of that. I know what Warrington's done today while they're in the news. They've actually got an energy farm, so they've actually generated a huge amount of income. Some councils are doing this, they're actually doing energy farms. Lots of other councils on energy, you asked me about that earlier, are doing energy consortiums, purchasing to bring down purchase price. So, again, a range of things, not just one thing. So I think that local government, when it comes through this, will be more resolved, actually. But then at the same time, if we're going into local government reorganisation, mayoral combined authorities and all of that, wherever that agenda is going, it's really, really important, I think, for the development industry and, in its broadest sense, to make sure that the new councils are set up to deliver. And one of the big mistakes that we could make in local government reorganisation is to have new, bigger councils, but just have the same old structures. And what we want is, when they establish, is to have a development team at the heart, a different structure to think about delivery in a different way, rather than establish the silos of departments and then try to bring it together. So I think LGR, in that sense, brings a good opportunity to think about structuring councils differently around going back to this kind of delivery role, I think.
Thank you very much for your insights, and
you're welcome.
very helpful.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you.